Hey guys, tonight we travel back, way back, to the sun-baked days of ancient Egypt. You find yourself standing on the edge of a riverbank, the mighty Nile sliding by in lazy ripples, glowing gold under a low, sleepy sun. There's no sound of cars, no buzzing phones, no rush to inbox zero. But believe it or not, someone in this world still expects a message to be delivered. And not just any message, a scroll of papyrus tightly rolled and sealed with clay, destined for a scribe half a town away. The catch? It's going to take 40 days to get there. That's right. You could walk the distance in 2 afternoons, but if you want it sent officially, via Egypt's proud and ponderous postal service, you better pack a few weeks' worth of patience and some strong sandals. You're about to find out why. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, where are you tuning in from? Drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing where our little sleepy history club reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the sandals of a courier, or maybe just an invisible observer, wandering through the heat-hazed alleys of Thebes or Memphis. In your hand is a scroll. Not just a casual note, but perhaps a royal directive or an inventory request or even a marriage negotiation between 2 high-ranking families who communicate more through scribes than actual eye contact. The air is thick with incense and dust, the stone walls painted in ochres and lapis blue, and everyone walks with purpose but not necessarily with speed. See, time moves differently here. The Nile floods and retreats like a breathing lung, and everything from farming to correspondence follows its rhythm. You follow a male runner, a lithe man in his early 30s, barefoot and wrapped in a linen kilt. He carries no bag, no uniform, but he does have a small wooden case for documents, tied shut with a cord that might as well be sacred. The weight of the scroll he carries is not in grams, but in the authority it represents. That scroll might have come from a palace or a temple, or from one merchant accusing another of shorting him on barley weights. Now, before we go too far, let's be clear. There wasn't a uniform Egyptian postal service like you'd imagine, with logos and slogans, unless the falcon god Horus counts as a kind of spiritual FedEx. Instead, there were overlapping systems run by temples, royal officials, military outposts, and local scribes. And they didn't exactly coordinate with one another, which is one reason mail took so long. It had to change hands. A lot, mainstream. Historians agree that Egypt had a functioning system of message delivery as early as the Old Kingdom, roughly 2700 BCE. But who controlled it, who used it, and how wide its reach stretched are still hot topics. Historians still argue whether ordinary citizens could use it at all, or if it was a strictly elite affair, sort of like how only the richest modern humans get to send astronauts into space. Let's get tactile. The scroll you're imagining isn't like modern paper. It's papyrus, a rough, almost crackly sheet made from river reeds pressed and dried, then glued into long rolls. Writing on it takes skill, ink made from soot or ochre, and the steady hand of a trained scribe. That means, of course, most people weren't writing their own mail. They'd dictate to scribes who jot it down in hieratic or demotic script, depending on the era. Hieroglyphs? Those were more for monuments and tombs, not love letters or neighborly complaints. Our mail runner stops at a small courtyard, where a temple servant waits under the shade of a date palm. They exchange a few words, mostly formal greetings, and the scroll is handed off. The runner's job is done for now. He might return tomorrow or in 3 days, depending on the rotation. The servant now takes responsibility, adding this: scroll to others heading the same way. You might wonder, why not just walk it over directly? Well, aside from the social hierarchy of who can go where, the delivery network depended on established routes and handoff stations. It was more like a series of daisy-chain deliveries than one long trip by the same person. Each station, sometimes a temple, sometimes a storehouse, became a checkpoint in a sleepy obstacle course of bureaucracy and ritual, and each handoff involved pauses, sometimes deliberate. Sometimes a matter of, the boat's not leaving for 3 days anyway. Remember, we're not talking about Amazon Prime. We're talking about ox carts and reed boats. Here's the fun bit. Clay seal impressions used to secure these scrolls sometimes included thumbprints of the officials who sealed them. One even shows signs of being pressed by what may have been a signet ring of a high priest. That makes them not just mail, but little artifacts of social standing. Another scroll once uncovered was a delivery of a love poem sent from a priest to a noblewoman. It was wrapped and marked with a symbol that could be interpreted as either a cat or a loaf of bread. Ancient emojis? Maybe. Or maybe someone got distracted mid-doodle. By now, you're sinking deeper into the rhythm of this old, slow world. 40. Days might seem ridiculous to you hunched over your glowing screen where an email flies from Cairo to Tokyo in seconds. But in Egypt, 40 days wasn't considered slow. It was considered precise, predictable, honest. You reach the next station, a temple shaded by sycamores echoing with the murmurs of chanting priests. The mail goes inside, a new courier will take over in the morning. And you? You rest now, your feet dusty, your mind full of the weight of a scroll that isn't just a piece of paper, but a slice of someone's intention, sealed in clay, carried on foot, guarded by gods and traveling through time. You wake to the sound of sandals slapping against stone and the low coo of pigeons nesting in the crooks of temple columns. The next courier is already moving, his path lit not by ambition, but by duty. He's younger than the last, maybe 16, with sun-browned skin and a kind of wiry energy you'd expect from someone who still believes he might become something more than a message mule. You follow him as he exits the temple compound, scroll tucked into the same wooden case. The priest had logged the delivery in a clay tablet ledger, a row of simple symbols noting the sender, the recipient, and perhaps an expected delivery moon phase. Expecting a date and time, that's cute. Time here is measured in shadows and seasons, not seconds. The courier takes the dusty main road southward toward the outskirts of town. It's not a straight shot. He weaves around market carts and herds of cattle, nods to veiled women at the well, and is stopped twice by men with questions he answers only after placing the case carefully on a wall. Even couriers need to gossip, after all. If you're hoping for galloping horses and dramatic cloak-flapping wind, sorry to disappoint. Horses weren't common for everyday transport in Old Kingdom Egypt. They were introduced much later, around 1600 BCE during the Hyksos period. Back in this moment, most messages are delivered on foot, or, if you're lucky, via donkey. The average courier walked roughly 20 kilometers a day in this kind of job, which sounds doable, until you realize he's doing it in 110-degree heat, carrying something precious enough to get him whipped if he loses it. Still, there's a quiet pride in it. Even the lowest-ranked runner knows messages are sacred. They bridge cities, temples, and people who may never meet, and if he's successful enough, he might graduate to higher ranks, those who carry royal letters or diplomatic scrolls sealed with the ring of a vizier. clockwork alert, in one preserved. Letter from a later period. A courier complains that someone stole his sandals mid-journey, and he had to borrow a pair from a fisherman just to make his next delivery. Historians still argue whether this was a real theft or just an elaborate excuse for being late. You can almost hear the teenager muttering, "My boss is going to kill me." The path leads past small estates, mud brick houses painted with whitewash, and granaries stacked with baskets of emmer wheat. You pass scenes of everyday life, a child chasing a goose, a woman grinding grain, an old man carving a wooden amulet of Bes, the protective dwarf god with a lion's mane and a permanent party face. Time creeps like the courier's steps. It takes most of the day to reach the next node, a way station just outside town near the edge of cultivated fields. These relay points were essential to Egypt's mail system. They weren't inns or post offices in the modern sense, but they served a similar function: places to rest, eat, hand off documents, and sometimes exchange donkeys. Most were maintained by temples or staffed by servants of provincial officials. Inside, a scribe sits cross-legged beside a low table, using a split reed pen to copy a duplicate version of the letter. It's a backup in case the original scroll is damaged. Scrolls were vulnerable, papyrus crumbles, ink fades, and sometimes a scroll gets used as emergency kindling. Better safe than sorry. So yes, ancient Egypt invented the carbon copy, though. Theirs was made with elbow grease, not cruelplutzy. Here, the courier swaps shifts with an older man, slower but more experienced. This fellow has crisscrossed Upper and Lower Egypt so many times he probably dreams in road maps. His beard is silvering at the edges, and his eyes squint not from age, but from years of staring into the reflective brightness of sand and sun. They share a modest meal, figs, flatbread, and a bit of dried fish before parting ways. The teen heads back the way he came. You might expect some kind of ceremonial passing of the scroll, but no, it's handed off like a sack of onions, albeit one that's been blessed, sealed, and triple-checked. Let's zoom out a little. Egypt's courier system was deeply entangled with its bureaucracy. Every town had scribes, tax collectors, priests, and overseers, all of whom needed to communicate, usually via scrolls carried by men like our older courier. But coordination was another matter. There was no grand master plan. Instead, it was layers of small, overlapping systems, temple mail, royal mail, merchant runners, all tangled together like threads in a particularly grumpy cat's yarn ball. Historians still argue whether there was a central body overseeing mail routes during certain dynasties, or if local officials made things up as they went. Evidence points both ways. One royal decree from the New Kingdom references official dispatches, implying a centralized system, but others describe regional scribes hiring their own couriers independently. Bureaucratic chaos? Probably. Beautifully slow chaos? Absolutely. Back. On the road, our courier walks into the rising dusk, sandals kicking up fine dust. He hums something, maybe a hymn to Thoth, god of wisdom and writing. Or maybe just a tune he picked up in Memphis. Either way, the scroll bumps gently inside the case like a heart wrapped in bark. You stop for a moment to rest with him under a palm tree, the sky bleeding purple above the horizon. Frogs croak somewhere nearby, and a heron watches you from the edge of an irrigation ditch. It's quiet here. Even the flies seem too tired to buzz. The courier sips water from a gourd, then leans back, eyes half-lidded. 40 days isn't a punishment in this world. It's the time things are supposed to take. You can't rush a flood, you can't hurry a god, and you definitely can't make a royal decree arrive any faster just because someone in Thebes wants to know if their grain order was approved. So you wait and walk and wait some more. The moon rises, casting its pale light on another day's worth of dust, steps, and the precious little scroll that's barely halfway to its destination. The sun stretches its golden limbs across the Nile as you and the courier reach the next phase of the journey, the river crossing. Now, this isn't just some scenic ferry ride. This is Egypt's main artery, its ancient expressway, and the most vital part of the mail delivery network, even if the express part is a bit generous. The Nile is wide here, lazily flowing with the quiet authority of something that knows it's been around longer than your entire civilization. Papyrus boats drift along its surface, their curved prows bobbing like giant fishhooks. Some are fishing vessels, others loaded with grain or amphorae of oil. But the ones we care about are the cargo boats, flat-bottomed, sluggish things made of wooden planks lashed together with palm fiber, creaking like old knees in the morning. Your courier's scroll will be loaded onto one of these vessels, nestled between crates of onions and maybe a sleeping cat or two. Because yes, river cargo boats often doubled as floating farms, goats, chickens and cats included. Ancient Egypt, where logistics meets livestock. The boat's captain is an older woman missing 2 teeth and full of river wisdom. She grumbles. About the wind, there isn't enough of it today, which means rowing. You glance down at the paddle in her calloused hands and realize this is not going to be fast. If Egypt's mail had a nemesis, it was the wind. Too much, too little, or coming from the wrong direction entirely. And yet there's something soothing about it. The sound of water lapping against the hull, the rhythmic splash of the oars, the occasional shout from a rival boat drifting too close. You sit beneath a woven canopy, sharing dried dates, and watching the green strip of farmland on either bank slowly scroll past like a moving painting. One major reason mail traveled so slowly was because it had to wait for these boats. They didn't leave on courier demand. They left when they were full or when the priest running the dock said it was time. This wasn't an Uber, it was a calendar event, often weekly, sometimes monthly. If you missed the boat, you'd better find a temple willing to sponsor a special journey, or you wait and wait. Historians still argue whether couriers had priority on boats, especially those carrying royal decrees. Some records suggest a seal from the pharaoh's palace guaranteed swift passage. Others imply even high officials had to get in, lying behind a crate of leeks. Bureaucracy does love its vegetables. The Nile itself was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it connected almost every major settlement in Egypt. On the other, it had moods. During inundation season, the annual flooding that renewed the farmland, boats moved faster thanks to higher waters. But in low season, when the river shrank, some parts became impassable, clogged with silt or too shallow for anything heavier than a duck. Quirk of the journey. Some mailboats had guardian gods carved into their prow. Tiny images of Horus, Bastet, or Sobek meant to protect the cargo from misfortune. One boat reportedly had a carved cat head, so realistic that fish would leap into the boat, confusing it for a predator. Useful, debatable, adorable, undeniably. Back on board, the courier takes this chance to nap. He curls up between 2 sacks of lentils and pulls a folded linen cloth over his eyes. That's the thing about these journeys. When you're not walking, you're waiting. And when you're waiting, you rest. Time becomes elastic. The message you carry is always urgent, but never fast. At a small riverside shrine, the boat stops briefly. Offerings must be made, nothing fancy, just a splash of beer and a few murmured words to Happy, god of the Nile. It's less about belief and more about habit. You don't tempt the river with arrogance. You ask nicely as the boat continues, A scribe on board takes the opportunity to make a few copies of temple correspondence. You watch him dip his reed pen into a small dish of black ink and scratch careful lines across fresh papyrus sheets. He's writing letters to be delivered upriver, to officials in Heliopolis perhaps, or to the granary keepers of Abydos. His handwriting is elegant, the kind that makes you feel instantly underqualified in every way. Mail aboard these boats wasn't only governmental. Merchants, priests, and even teachers used the system. One preserved papyrus is just a grocery list, with aggressive underlining next to figs and lotus wine, which feels like the ancient version of texting "Don't forget the milk." As the sun dips toward the western horizon, the boat finally drifts toward a dock, a cluster of weather-worn pylons manned by temple servants. The cargo is unloaded with minimal ceremony. The scroll, still tightly wrapped and sealed, is handed over to a new courier, this one wearing a necklace shaped like the Eye of Horus. Protective charm? Likely. Fashion statement? Also likely. This courier has his own path to follow, on foot. Again, heading inland toward a town too far from the river to be reached by boat. Another leg. Another delay. Another chapter in this papyrus epic of divine patience. You disembark with him, stepping into the darkening landscape as crickets begin their evening chorus. There's no rush. The message is still intact. The world hasn't collapsed because it took a week just to switch couriers. The stars appear so bright, so bold you could read by them, which some people did, in fact. Astronomers among temple scribes charted their positions to decide on auspicious delivery days. If Venus was rising in the east, maybe today wasn't a good day to send that papyrus about tax disputes. Let it sit another night. Let it breathe. So the courier settles near a sycamore, building a tiny fire and brewing a bit of date wine in a clay pot. You sit beside him. The air is warm, full of that rich earth smell only Egypt seems to possess. The scroll waits between. You both no closer to its destination, but not forgotten. Tomorrow's another leg, another relay, and you still have, 35 days to go. The morning begins not with a horn or bell, but with the sound of birds gossiping from the reeds, and the soft groan of a courier stretching sore limbs beneath a sky already warming with desert breath. You're still out on the fringe of the Nile's influence, the land shifting from green to a dusty beige that crunches beneath your sandals. The courier rubs the sleep from his eyes and checks the scroll case, still sealed and bound with cord, and then onward. He walks with that distinctive gait of someone who knows he'll be walking all day. No rush, no panic, just the steady pace of a man carrying importance disguised as boredom. Today's route winds away from the Nile, cutting through a stretch of semi-arid farmland toward a small administrative outpost. It's nothing impressive, just a gathering of mud brick buildings, a granary with a thatched roof, and a guard post manned by a man so still he might be a statue. Why this outpost matters? Because of records. The beating heart of ancient Egyptian communication wasn't just movement, it was management. Every letter, every papyrus, every tiny administrative update had to be tracked, copied, and filed away somewhere. Usually on shelves that were more optimistic than organized. This post is where the scroll's journey is logged again. A local scribe, shirt half open, eyes already rimmed in red from ink fumes and the weight of bureaucracy, greets the courier with the enthusiasm of a man who has seen too many papyri in his lifetime. He scratches a few lines onto a clay tablet, then stamps it with a carved stone seal. An image of a jackal, poised mid-run. Official enough. Historians still argue whether these regional scribes had autonomy or were micromanaged by Thebes or Memphis. The reality? Probably both. Egypt ran on redundancy. Multiple scribes might record the same delivery at different posts, each insisting his version was the definitive one. It's the world's oldest case of too many cooks, but instead of soup, it's ink on papyrus. Meanwhile, the courier has to wait, again, because there's a new rule being enforced. Documents can't proceed past this post without being weighed. Yes, weighed. Apparently, someone up the chain had decided that scrolls over a certain weight required extra wax seals. It's a security measure maybe, or just another way to show off your bureaucratic creativity. The courier rolls his eyes in a way that transcends time and language. You'd recognize that look anywhere. This is above my pay grade, so they place the scroll in a tiny balance scale countered with stone weights shaped like tiny frogs. It passes, barely. No extra seals needed today. The courier mutters a silent thank you to Thoth. While this rigmarole continues, you wander around the outpost. A group of boys plays Senate beneath a shady awning, flicking tiny sticks and shouting. Accusations of cheating. A woman carries a basket of lentils balanced on her head with perfect posture. A cluster of men sit around a pot of beer, so sour you can smell it from 3 meters away. Fermented with bread, it's chunky and warm, but beloved. You overhear one of them joke. A letter from Thebes is like a tortoise. If it arrives at all, it's because it forgot it was slow. The courier finally receives the go-ahead, but now he's not alone. Another runner joins him, heading in the same direction. Not competition, companionship. Runners often traveled in pairs when routes crossed. It was safer. And besides, who doesn't want someone to complain with? This new courier carries a scroll with a red ochre line, urgent. You'd expect him to be sprinting, but no. Still the same unhurried pace. Urgent in this world means by the end of the month, maybe. Their path cuts through rougher terrain now. The cultivated farmland thins out, replaced by scraggly bushes and the occasional bleached tree trunk. It's hot, and your tongue feels sticky just from watching them. They stop at a small shrine halfway along the trail. An offering station, marked by a crude carving of Taweret, the hippo goddess who protected travelers and pregnant women. 2 categories that may not overlap often, but both equally in need of divine backup. They leave a few dates as offering, not out of piety exactly, but habit. When you're carrying messages that might affect land ownership, temple funding, or someone's monthly barley allotment, you don't risk divine indifference. Quirk for the day. 1 recovered papyrus, sent from a scribe in Akhmim to his brother in another district, included not only a letter, but a drawing of a goose wearing a crown. No explanation, no context, just a fabulous goose. Scholars remain baffled and delighted. The day drips past like honey on hot stone. You walk. You rest, you swat flies, you step around a snake who looks vaguely disinterested in poisoning you, which is polite. Occasionally, you pass another traveler. Couriers nod to one another, but rarely stop. Everyone's got scrolls, everyone's got somewhere to be. Eventually, you reach the next marker, a stone column carved with the regional district symbol. This is the boundary into new territory, and with it, new delays. Each district has its own policies, its own scribes, and sometimes its own dialect quirks. A scroll that made perfect sense in one region might be misread or misfiled, if not retranscribed to match the next district's system. It's like handing someone a perfectly typed memo only to be told, "Sorry, this office only reads cursive Comic Sans." Historians still argue whether this language drift contributed to delays, especially in far-flung territories like Elephantine or Siwa. Some believe Standard Hieratic was used universally. Others argue that regional variations crept in and had to be smoothed out at each checkpoint. Either way, couriers often had to wait while scribes made adjustments. The scroll might not change, but the presentation did. You stop for the night under a domed tree, stars blinking through gaps in the branches. The two couriers share a small stew, lentils, garlic, and dried fish, cooked over a whispering fire. It's quiet until one of them starts humming a tune. You realize it's the same tune the last courier was humming by the river. An unofficial anthem of the scroll bearers, maybe? Or just the catchiest melody in the Nile Valley. The scroll rests. Nearby, tucked under a folded cloth, its journey paused but not forgotten. It's now passed through 4 hands, 3 logs, 2 boats, and 1 ridiculous frog weight scale. And it's still only about a quarter of the way through the city. Sleep comes easy out here, the kind of sleep that wraps around you like linen. Sheets baked warm in the sun, the stars don't hurry. Neither does the message, and neither do you. You wake to the sound of footsteps crunching over sand and the low murmurs of the two couriers prepping for the day's journey, repacking scroll cases, tying up sandals, and muttering half-asleep oaths about the gods of sore knees. Dawn is, stretching over the land like spilled honey, tinting everything in copper and rose gold. It would be beautiful if you didn't know that today's route runs directly through the goat path of bureaucracy. Yes, we've arrived at the checkpoint temple. To the untrained eye, it looks like just another cluster of stone columns and half-crumbled statues, but to the ancient Egyptian mail system, this is where information goes to be questioned, examined, and, quite often, delayed indefinitely. Because here, every scroll must be verified by temple scribes who act as both inspectors and gatekeepers of official correspondence. The courier approaches the outer hall where a young novice, likely only 12 or 13, greets him with exaggerated importance. His job? To bring the scroll inside and alert the master scribe. But first, the courier has to answer a few questions. Name, route taken, last checkpoint, whether the gods were properly honored, and, this one's real, how many times the scroll was set down during the journey. Because according to one temple's record-keeping manual, prolonged contact with the earth could render sacred text spiritually impure. You're not sure what that means, but you hope it doesn't involve a ritual scrubbing. The temple interior is cool and dim, smelling of frankincense, stone, and something faintly resembling boiled onions. The master scribe sits cross-legged on a raised dais, surrounded by a half-dozen assistants. He wears an elaborate collar, several rings, and the look of someone who has waited decades to reject something on a technicality. The courier presents the scroll. The master scribe does not touch it, not yet. First, he studies the seal. He tilts it, peers at the imprint, sniffs it. You're not sure if that last part has any real purpose, but it feels right somehow. Then comes the unsealing. Done with. A tiny bronze blade. The scroll is gently unrolled on a linen cloth, away from any surfaces that might have seen, say, a beetle or a particularly disobedient crumb. The inspection begins. Historians still argue whether temples added notes or commentary to official scrolls. Some evidence suggests scribes would insert marginalia, tiny marks or even symbolic glyphs, indicating whether a scroll had passed certain spiritual or procedural thresholds. Others believe temple scribes were strictly passive processors. You'd lean toward the former if you saw the sharp glee in this scribe's eyes. Today's scroll passes inspection, but not without pause. There's a segment containing a number, possibly referring to the grain yield from a northern province, that's smudged, just barely. The scribe makes a note, frowns, and then, rather dramatically, re-inks the number in his own hand. There. Now it's clearer. Whether he actually corrected a mistake or just added a personal flair, you'll never know. What we do know is this. The scroll is now blessed for travel, which sounds beautiful. It's also code for we stamped it, we scribbled on it, and if it gets lost, it's not our fault, but there's a cost. Literally, the temple requests a token offering for the service, a small bag of barley, a chunk of beeswax, or, in the case of this courier, the last fig in his travel pouch. He gives it up with a sigh. You can feel his heartbreak over that fig. It was a good fig. A quick detour on temple tidbits. Did you know some temples operated their own internal messenger systems? Within their massive complexes, they dispatch boys or young scribes to run messages from the outer courtyards to the inner sanctums. One temple even had a carved map detailing recommended running paths through the halls, complete with symbols warning against entering rooms with sacred rituals in progress. Entering the wrong one, that could get you smacked with a papyrus scroll, or worse, assigned permanent latrine duty. Back to the journey, with the scroll resealed and blessed, the courier is free to go. But now he's accompanied by a new figure, a temple-appointed witness, whose job is to ensure the message is not altered before final delivery. Think of him as the ancient Egyptian version of a notary public, except with less paperwork and more eyeliner. This man, tall and draped in white linen, doesn't speak much. He carries a staff with a carved ibis head, symbol of Thoth, god of writing, and walks with a slow, measured pace, as if every step is a calligraphic stroke. You suspect he'd make excellent tea and a terrible dinner guest. Together, the trio, courier, notary, and you, the invisible observer, descends from the temple into the outer village, heading toward the administrative quarter, where scrolls are sorted for local redistribution. Here, the system becomes gloriously tangled. See, not all scrolls go directly to their recipient. Many first pass through a central record house where senior scribes determine if the message must be duplicated, archived, or forwarded to another department. One letter might end up copied 6 times, once for temple records, once for the regional governor, once for the tax collectors, once for the head priest, once for a granary official, and once just in case someone loses the original, which happens a lot. The record house is bustling when you arrive. Couriers, scribes, bored guards leaning on spears. You hear the scratching of reeds on papyrus, the shuffle of sandals, and the occasional exasperated by Osiris's toenails from a scribe trying to find yesterday's inventory list. Inside, a middle-aged woman with ink-stained fingers and a tone sharp enough to cut limestone demands the scroll. The notary hands it over with a slight bow. She unfurls it, eyes it, nods, and immediately calls over a junior scribe. Copy this, twice, and write neater this time. The junior scribe sighs but obeys. You suspect this might be his 17th scroll today. And here, we wait again. The courier slumps onto a bench, finally pulling out a wedge of stale bread and chewing like a man in mourning. The notary sits beside him, silent as a statue. The copying will take hours, maybe longer. Ink has to dry, seals must be pressed, fingers cramp, tempers flare. One scribe drops a scroll and immediately receives the sharpest lecture ever delivered in ancient Egyptian, which involves, surprisingly, creative uses of the word hippopotamus. But in all this chaos, the system still works imperfectly, painfully, slowly, but it works. Messages get delivered, records get preserved, figs get sacrificed. And you? You're halfway there. Evening pools in the corners of the record house, as oil lamps sputter to life, their flames flickering like the eyes of gossiping gods. The air now carries a heavier musk, wax, dust, and the faint but growing aroma of boiled chickpeas from a vendor just outside the courtyard. You're still perched near the courier, who is stretching his legs while watching the junior scribe dry his second copy of the scroll using a breeze from a feather fan. It's like watching someone blow dry a sacred document. Slow, gentle, unnecessarily sensual. At last the copies are finished. Each one rolled with care, each seal pressed with a symbol denoting not just the origin temple, but the specific scribe who transcribed it. Imagine your initials being immortalized in wax, not because you were famous, but because your job was to spell barley ration correctly. The original scroll is returned to the courier. The notary nods, duty fulfilled, and drifts off to the next ritual appointment like a bureaucratic phantom. You, however, remain with the courier as he prepares to depart yet again, this time deeper into the tangle of the city. Now we enter the district shuffle. This part of the journey is less about distance and more about decoding where, exactly, the scroll must go next. Unlike modern mail with zip codes and GPS routes, ancient Egyptian scrolls were addressed with layers of vague bureaucracy. To the overseer of the outer silos, South Granary Division, West Warehouse Hall, could refer to a man who changed job titles last week and moved his office 2 corridors down. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians had a standard layout for administrative centers or if each was a unique, whimsical mess based on who ruled it. The archaeological remains of various district hubs suggest a combination of structured planning and glorious chaos, kind of like a filing cabinet that was designed geometrically but populated by squirrels. As you move from the central record house into the city proper, things become loud. Street vendors shout prices over the clop of donkeys. Children sprint past with arms full of laundry and dreams of dinner. A priest chants softly in the doorway of a home, offering a blessing for a newborn swaddled in linen so tight he looks like a very holy burrito. Your courier weaves through the mess with surprising agility, ignoring the man trying to sell him a lucky beetle and ducking beneath a low-hanging rack of dyed fabrics. You're now headed toward a building known to couriers only as the sorting court. Despite the name, it's not an actual courtroom. No trials or arguments here. Well, unless you count the time 2 couriers nearly came to blows over who had priority, the sorting court is a mid-level hub, a place where mail is redirected, usually based on whether its recipient has moved, been reassigned, or, awkwardly, died. Yes, scrolls sometimes arrived at their final checkpoint only to discover that the recipient was no longer living. In such cases, the scroll might be filed, burned, or, if it contained instructions, redirected to a successor. One discovered document was labeled "For the one who comes after," which sounds poetic until you realize it probably meant, "Hey, new guy, this is your mess now." In the sorting court, our courier meets another layer of the mail pyramid, the document interpreters. These aren't your typical scribes. Their job is to decipher not the words, but the intent behind the scroll, its tone, urgency, even its subtext. Was it a warning, a complaint, a coded request for additional barley rations disguised as a temple donation request? Quirky scroll time. A letter from a local priest to his cousin contained the phrase, "The fish swims thick today, and the lotus wilts." Historians aren't sure if this was a metaphor for bad weather or an insult about someone's new girlfriend. Interpret that, Indiana Jones. The interpreter today is an older woman with sharp eyes and fingers stained with layers of old ink. She reads quickly, lips moving silently, and then lifts one eyebrow in that universal gesture of, "Huh." After a pause, she asks a junior to fetch a ledger, a stone slab with etchings detailing all currently active grain officials in the city. Turns out the scroll's recipient was recently reassigned. Classic. So now it's off to the secondary. Office of Crop Distribution, located, of course, across the city and up a steep hill. You hear the courier sigh. You feel it in your soul, but there's no time to grumble. Well, actually, there's always time to grumble. And he does, but quietly, between bites of a lentil ball he bought from a street vendor who seems both ancient and deeply unimpressed by everything. The journey to the secondary office is a tour of city life. A woman sweeping dust off her roof with the precision of a dancer. A boy chasing a monkey who definitely doesn't belong to him. A man delivering wine amphorae while arguing with himself about whether his wife actually likes wine or just says she does. All the while, you follow the courier, scroll case thumping gently at his hip like a persistent question. By the time you reach the new office, the sun is lowering again, tinting the limestone walls with orange shadows. The building is quieter, less bustling, more focused. It's managed by a handful of older scribes, and here's where things finally start to feel close, like the scroll might soon meet its intended hands. Inside, the head scribe, a man with a beard so perfectly combed it could be its own deity, receives the scroll with reverence. He knows what it is, or at least he recognizes the seal. He nods, unrolls it, and reads. Then he frowns. Then he chuckles. You lean in, curious. He taps the scroll, turns to the courier, and says something that loosely translates to, "This was supposed to go to the outer division, not this office," and thus begins the sacred rite of rerouting. Historians still argue whether these kinds of misdirections were rare hiccups or daily occurrences. One papyrus recovered near Luxor lists 17 scrolls redirected over 4 weeks, some of them ping-ponging between offices like a bureaucratic tennis match, and some scholars believe this inefficiency was deliberate, a way to delay decisions until the administration could decide if it even wanted to deal with the request. So, one more resealing, one more log entry, one more polite curse muttered beneath the breath. The courier doesn't mind, he's been through worse, and after all, there's a bakery along the way with honey cakes only available at dusk. Maybe the gods delayed this scroll for a reason. The day fades as you follow him out the door again, scroll in hand, sun behind your back, and the long road stretching before you. Still not there, but closer. And yes, the honey cake was worth it. The street lights of the city glow faintly in the distance as you follow the courier, now somewhat more chipper, thanks to that honey cake and a brief but spirited argument with a merchant about the quality of the figs. You've arrived at a slightly more peaceful stretch of the journey, though that doesn't mean it's over by any means. No, you're still deep in the heart of the bureaucratic labyrinth, and the final destination, the actual delivery of the scroll, is still a distant dream, flickering like a mirage on the horizon. Your courier, however, has a look of quiet determination. He's walked this path many times. He's no longer surprised by the detours or delays. To him, this entire process is just as natural as the Nile flooding every year. It's all part of the rhythm of life, a rhythm that, strangely enough, even the gods seem to respect. When a scroll is meant to get where it's going, it will eventually. In fact, that's a philosophy shared by many ancient Egyptians, especially those involved in the larger-scale logistics that ensured the empire ran smoothly. Whether transporting grain, goods, or messages, they trusted the process, believing that things would reach their destination in time, even if that time was annoyingly slow. And now, as night falls over the city, we enter the postal nexus, the last stretch of the courier's journey, but also the place where you start to get the sense that the system is almost, just almost, running on autopilot. The postal nexus isn't a building per se, but a sprawling network of local officials, scribes, and runners, each of whom is responsible for delivering messages to specific locations within their jurisdiction. This is the final sorting point, the last piece of the puzzle, where a scroll either continues its journey or gets lost in the shuffle, possibly forever. Here, you might find someone who knows exactly where your scroll needs to go, or you might find someone who's too distracted to care. You and the courier arrive at a large open square where several officials sit at low tables, scribbling furiously in their ledgers. The atmosphere here is a curious blend of calm professionalism and barely contained chaos. There's no sign of urgency, but you get the distinct impression that everyone is simply too tired to care. The air smells of ink, unwashed linen, and the occasional faint whiff of burnt incense from a nearby temple. It's here the courier's last task begins. He must present his scroll to the chief of delivery, a position that may sound important, but often involves little more than a quick glance and a stamped seal of approval. You could say it's a final checkpoint of sorts, but don't get too excited. This is not a dramatic moment. There is no fanfare, no ceremonial music, no grand speeches. Just a scribe with a little too much eyeliner and a slightly smug look on his face. The chief of delivery, an older man with an expression as dry as the desert, takes the scroll. He inspects it carefully, as though every millimeter of papyrus has a story to tell. Perhaps he's wondering how many times this scroll has changed hands. Perhaps he's debating whether he's really in the mood to stamp it today. Historians still argue whether this step was ever necessary or simply another bureaucratic formality added to prevent people from wandering around aimlessly. After all, was the scroll really delivered if there was no official stamp? Did it truly arrive if it wasn't processed by just one more person along the way? Some scholars claim this was a form of insurance, an extra layer of accountability in case anything went wrong down the line. Others believe the whole process was merely an elaborate social contract to ensure that everyone got a little bit of work done just so they could feel useful. The chief of delivery stamps the scroll with a decisive thunk that echoes across the courtyard. You watch the courier's shoulders relax slightly, the tension of the past hours finally releasing. The courier then gives the chief a nod and waits. The chief doesn't speak, he just waves him off, indicating it's time to leave. And, with that, the scroll is officially en route. The courier clutches it with a firm hand, his fingers almost caressing the seal as though he's just been handed something sacred. He's still not there yet, but this is the moment he's been waiting for. One final step remains, to deliver the scroll to its true recipient. After all the winding paths, the red tape, the endless detours and reseals, it's time to hand off the message to someone who will read it, perhaps scribble their own notes on it, and then, who knows, send it back into the system again. You know the process won't stop here. After all, there are always more scrolls to be sent, more messages to be passed along. The wheels of bureaucracy turn ever onward, a machine that never sleeps, only briefly pauses when someone realizes they forgot to include a proper seal or sign-off. No one stops to question whether it's worth it. It just is. But what's more incredible than that? It works, after all, even if it takes forever. At long last, the courier reaches his final destination, a small but bustling residence near the edge of the city, where an official inside is waiting for the scroll's delivery. He knocks on the door. It opens. The recipient, an older man with a rather questionable beard, looks at the scroll, squints at the courier, and then accepts it with a solemn nod. Historians still argue whether this final exchange, where the scroll is passed to its rightful owner, was meant to symbolize something deeper about the Egyptian worldview. Was it simply about getting messages from point A to point B? Or was it a deeper statement about the balance of power, the importance of communication, and the way civilization depends on individuals and institutions working together in seemingly endless and sometimes seemingly pointless ways? The answer is lost to history. But as the recipient unrolls the scroll, checks its seal, and begins reading, you realize something. The journey was worth it. Not because it was fast, not because it was simple, but because it was a reminder that things take time, and sometimes that's okay. You watch the courier turn and leave, his shoulders now carrying less weight, his walk a little less hurried. There's a sense of quiet satisfaction in his step. He's done his job. The scroll has reached its final destination. The cycle will soon begin again, and for a brief moment, you realize maybe that's all we can really ask for. The cool night air is a relief as you step outside, a gentle breeze sweeping through the narrow streets of the city. You glance at the courier one last time, watching him as he disappears into the dark, his silhouette fading into the labyrinthine alleyways. His work, though arduous, is now complete. But this, you realize, is far from the end of the story. No, you're only now beginning to appreciate the true complexity of this journey, the ancient system that kept Egypt's vast empire connected through its myriad districts, cities, and remote outposts. With the scroll finally in the hands of its rightful recipient, it may seem like the story is over. The end of the journey, after all, is the moment of delivery, right? Wrong. What you've learned so far is just one layer of the system. Now you need to ask, what happens next? As the courier fades from view, you're left to consider the practical reality of ancient Egyptian communication. Sure, the scrolls get delivered, but what about the return journey? The process wasn't just one way. Messages had to go back and forth, constantly bouncing between temples, bureaucratic offices, and the hands of scribes. Egypt wasn't built on one-way communication. It was an endless cycle of correspondence, as officials sought updates, clarifications, and responses to their requests. The messengers didn't get to rest long. In fact, historians still argue whether the Egyptians were more preoccupied with their outbound messages or the influx of information they needed to process. Some believe the complexity of returning messages, along with the many layers of bureaucracy, was far more taxing than initial delivery. Can you imagine? A system so intricate, so dependent on the careful balance of communication, that one lost. Message could send everything into disarray. Now let's think about the scale of it all. The journey the scroll just took, multiply it by thousands, tens of thousands. Messages were moving across Egypt from the heart of Thebes to the farthest outposts along the Nile, all of them trickling through a series of connected small hubs. The speed of movement, well, you're already familiar with how it takes days to move a short distance. Now imagine the logistics required to ensure a constant flow of vital information to keep the kingdom's vast operations running smoothly. It's almost staggering to consider the network of people involved. Scribes, clerks, guards, and of course the couriers who navigated the twists and turns of this complex bureaucratic world, all while depending on the whims of the weather and the sheer unpredictability of everyday life. One of the quirky facts about this system is the hierarchical nature of Egyptian mail distribution. If you were an official at a high level, you probably didn't have to worry about making sure your letters made it to their destination. You'd just seal it, hand it off to the nearest scribe, and trust that it would somehow get to where it needed to go, eventually. However, lower-level couriers, well, they had a much more complicated life. They had to rely on a constant network of informal pathways, quick shortcuts, trusted local contacts, and maybe even the occasional bribe to ensure a document, arrived at its destination without delay. As you follow the long stretch of night, the city around you seems to breathe a little slower. The intense bustle of the day has dimmed, and there's a rare quiet now. The rhythm of the city is still palpable, but it's different. It's more like the calming lull of a temple after evening prayers. For a brief moment, there's stillness. In this piece, you begin to imagine the unseen people whose efforts were key to making Egypt's communication system work. People who, despite their significance, were mostly invisible. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians ever truly understood how vital this web of communication was to their survival. Could they have ever anticipated just how intertwined their existence was with these scrolls? What would they have thought of the speed at which we communicate today, with messages traveling across the world in seconds? You continue to walk through the quiet streets, the shadows of buildings stretched long by the moonlight. In the distance, the sounds of the market still echo faintly, reminding you that life in the city doesn't pause for long. The market traders may rest, but the system doesn't stop. Messages continue to pass through the labyrinth, up and down, side to side, all as if the very lifeblood of the kingdom depends on it. And now, at last, you realize something truly profound about this ancient system. It wasn't just about the scrolls. It wasn't just about the messages, the seals, or the painstaking process of making sure something reached its destination. It was about trust. The trust between the people who created the messages, the scribes who transcribed them, the couriers who delivered them, and even the officials who read them. It was a delicate balance of faith in each other, and faith that the system would work. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was enough to keep an empire of millions connected, even if only just. There's something beautiful about that. In a world where everything seems instantaneous now, maybe, it's a reminder that some things worth doing take time. And sometimes it's that very passage of time, the long, winding road to the final destination, that makes the message truly meaningful. As you round the corner, your thoughts drift once again to the figures who move through these streets every day. The scribes, the couriers, the officials, all part of a machine so intricate it can never truly be fully understood. And yet they do it every day, every month, every year. It's almost magical, isn't it? The way that one tiny scroll passed from hand to hand can have such a huge impact on an empire that lasted thousands of years. The journey was long, but, as always, the process was worth it. The morning sun creeps up over the horizon, casting a soft glow on the streets you've just walked. The city is beginning to stir once again, but for now, it's still shrouded in a quiet calm. The night's reflections fade away as the first signs of life emerge, but you carry with you a new understanding. The labyrinth of Egyptian bureaucracy is vast and complex, a system in constant motion, an intricate dance of communication and organization that stretched across the length and breadth of the empire. Yet it was a world that didn't rest on the speed of information, but on its reliability, its predictability. Now imagine that cycle starting anew. A new courier, fresh-faced and eager, or perhaps a little tired already, leaves the city center with a fresh batch of scrolls under his arm. He will follow the same winding path you just witnessed, retracing the steps you've come to know so well. His mission is no different than the one you followed, the delivery of messages that will eventually weave together the fabric of Egyptian society, keep the temples running, and ensure the kingdom's far-reaching communications remain intact. The concept of repeatability is essential here. Ancient Egyptian mail wasn't just a one-off, it was part of a broader, ongoing system. The scrolls didn't just sit in archives waiting for someone to finally read them. No, they were actively part of the conversation, continually exchanged, re-exchanged, and debated. It was a constant cycle, a web that kept growing but never seemed to end. It's almost like the eternal loop of the Nile itself. The way it floods and recedes, life springing forth from its waters and yet returning again to the same place. In fact, it's not hard to draw parallels between the Egyptian mail system and the ancient concept of time. The Egyptians understood time not as a straight line, but more like a circular pattern, much like their journey through the streets, where each delivery eventually found its way back to the beginning. This cyclical nature of time is ingrained in every facet of Egyptian life, and perhaps it's this very pattern that allowed their systems of communication to flourish. One important part of this system is the role of the scribes. Think of them as the unofficial gatekeepers of information. They were the ones who transcribed official messages, often at the behest of local officials or even royal figures. These scribes didn't just write for the sake of writing. Their pens were tools that maintained the delicate balance of information throughout the empire. In fact, their training was a lengthy and arduous process, one that required memorizing hundreds of hieroglyphs, a skill so specialized that it essentially kept them in a class of their own. Historians still argue whether scribes were truly revered as the intellectual elite of society, or if their roles were more akin to skilled artisans who were essential but never truly acknowledged for their intellectual prowess. After all, scribes didn't wield power in the way that priests or pharaohs did, but their work kept the gears of the empire turning. Without them, the delivery of scrolls and the continuous flow of communication would have collapsed under its own weight. In a world so reliant on written records, it was the scribes who carried the kingdom's institutional memory. Imagine for a moment what it would be like to hold that responsibility. You're the person who preserves the law, the business transactions, the royal decrees, and the requests for grain or soldiers or tools. Every scroll you touch carries with it a piece of history. Every line you write, every mark you make holds the power to influence the course of events, even if it's never fully recognized. The scribes were also responsible for quality control. You might say they were the first editors. If a scroll was to be delivered, it had to meet a certain standard of writing. Any mistake, no matter how small, could mean a delay, or worse, a failure to get the message across. This kind of responsibility could make the scribes both meticulous and occasionally paranoid. Every mark of ink had to be perfect, or the sender might never receive the reply they were waiting for. If you thought proofreading a report was hard, imagine doing it on papyrus under the flickering light of a humble oil lamp. As you continue to reflect on the day's events, you start to understand the true scope of the Egyptian communication system. It wasn't just about getting from point A to point B, it was about the precision with which they did so. This wasn't a chaotic process. It was a carefully orchestrated machine, fueled by a deep understanding of human nature, patience, and the need for order. And then, just as quickly as it all started, you realize something else. Maybe all of this was designed with one purpose in mind. The ancient Egyptians weren't just trying to deliver messages. They were trying to maintain control over vast distances, control over vast numbers of people, and control over the very flow of information itself. By creating this intricate web of communication, they ensured their empire could withstand the test of time. For those at the top, the pharaohs and high-ranking officials, this was a tool of governance. For the scribes and the couriers, it was a matter of livelihood. But for the common people of Egypt, the message was simple. As long as the scrolls kept moving, as long as communication persisted, the empire would endure, and that, in the end, is the real genius of ancient Egyptian mail. It wasn't the speed or the complexity, it was the fact that it worked, and kept working, for thousands of years. The kingdom may have fallen, but the system, the idea that communication can transcend time and distance no matter how long the journey, is something that endured far beyond the pharaohs themselves. With the day now fully underway, you realize that even in the quietest moments of Egyptian life, when the streets are empty and the sun is still low on the horizon, the rhythms of communication continue. The scrolls never stop moving. They are, in a way, eternal, and though their travels may have been slow and cumbersome, they always arrived, just as the Nile's floodwaters will return again and again. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians ever fully appreciated the magnificence of their own communication system. But one thing is certain. They left behind a legacy of connectedness, a legacy of people working together, carrying words across miles and generations, all with the purpose of keeping their world alive. And that's something worth remembering. The sun is now fully up, bathing the city in warmth as you walk through bustling streets, the quiet reverie of dawn now a distant memory. The hum of daily life fills the air, merchants setting up their stalls, people haggling, children darting, around their laughter spilling out between the high stone buildings. Yet even in this busy scene, you begin to notice the quiet persistence of the communication system you've been following. It's still there, like the steady beat of a heart beneath all the noise. The echoes of Egypt's ancient bureaucratic machinery reverberate in ways you might not immediately recognize. The rhythm is still the same, even though time has passed, and much has changed. Today, it might be hard to imagine how such a complex system could exist in a world so deeply reliant on physical transport. Today, messages travel at the speed of light, flickering across screens without so much as a thought. But back then, the Egyptians didn't have the luxury of instant communication. If they wanted to get a message from one corner of the empire to another, it involved real people, the scribes, the couriers, the high officials, and those people had to take time to make sure the message was understood and delivered properly. In fact, one of the most curious features of the ancient Egyptian communication system was how formality played a huge role in ensuring messages were taken seriously. Every piece of correspondence had its own specific set of rules, rules that dictated not only how the message should be written, but also how it should be presented. Think of it as a kind of hierarchical language. For a commoner, writing a letter or sending a message could be an intensely personal thing. For an official, however, it was an entirely different matter. The use of particular symbols, the types of ink, and even the way the scroll was rolled up, all of it sent a message, not just to the recipient, but to anyone who might come across it. The higher you were in the social ladder, the more decorum your message was imbued with. As you imagine a pharaoh sending a decree, perhaps for more grain or a royal command to the army, you can almost feel the formality of it. The language wouldn't just be formal, but almost sacred in its tone, invoking the gods themselves to ensure the message's importance. Those at the highest levels of government, particularly the priests who held significant sway in Egyptian society, would have understood the power of these formal letters. This formality didn't just keep order, it reinforced it. If a letter was written improperly or didn't conform to the expected codes, it might be ignored or even dismissed as irrelevant. As strange as it seems, the right format could be the difference between being taken seriously or not. In a way, it's not all that different from today's world, where even our modern emails or letters need to follow certain formats or standards to be seen as legitimate. Some things, it seems, never change. Now, as you think about all these formalities, there's another side to the story that shouldn't be overlooked. For all the structure and authority in the system, there was also a deep reliance on local knowledge. The couriers, the scribes, and even the officials often had to rely on the understanding of the local geography, social norms, and even personal networks to ensure that messages were delivered swiftly and accurately. In a world without digital maps or satellite tracking, One of the most critical tasks was navigating the terrain. Ancient Egypt was vast, spanning hundreds of miles across. Deserts, mountains, and lush riverbanks. For the couriers, getting lost or missing an important connection could derail an entire message. And even though the Nile served as a main route for many deliveries, the waterway itself wasn't always predictable. You could be sailing along smoothly one day, only to be caught in an unexpected flood or drought the next. These fluctuations in the river's flow, combined with shifting winds across the desert, were constant challenges that the system had to adapt to. A quirky tidbit here is the importance of local knowledge, or more specifically, local guides. These guides weren't always official couriers. They were often people from the region who had an intimate understanding of the land, its waterways, and the local customs. Sometimes, these local experts could be relied upon to navigate the most complicated routes, avoiding obstacles or even potential dangers along the way. In essence, they were the navigators of the ancient world, without whom the message might never arrive. But there's a catch. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians relied more on these informal methods of travel and communication, or if the official courier system always had a far more structured network that could bypass the challenges of local terrain. Was there an underground network of unofficial channels where messages bypassed the formalities and flowed faster through trusted individuals? Or did the empire's bureaucratic approach always manage to maintain control, ensuring messages were only passed through official, structured means? This debate has led to some interesting discoveries. Modern scholars have even uncovered evidence that some couriers would partner with local villagers or traders to speed up deliveries. These partnerships often ensured that messages didn't just flow along the main routes, but could also cut through lesser-known paths, ensuring they arrived at their destination as quickly as possible. It's an unexpected twist, considering how much ancient Egypt relied on the formal structure of bureaucracy. Still at the heart of it all was the goal of efficiency. For the pharaohs, every single letter that traveled across Egypt was a piece of governance. Whether it was a military order, a tax request, or a decree about public works, it all needed to happen as smoothly and predictably as possible. The stakes were high. One delay could disrupt entire regions, and the message itself could hold the fate of thousands in its words. It's almost hard to imagine the sheer responsibility that rested on these couriers, on these scribes, to keep the entire machinery of ancient Egypt running. And yet they did it day in and day out, repeating their journeys over and over, sending and receiving scrolls until the whole system seemed like it was as natural as the rising and setting of the sun. As you reflect on all of this, the thought of how ancient Egypt managed to keep its vast empire connected is both humbling and impressive. Their mail system was not perfect, but it was functional, and above all, it was sustained by the efforts of countless people working together, each part playing a crucial role in making sure the messages got through. And in a world as chaotic and vast as ancient Egypt, that alone was an extraordinary feat. As the day drifts into afternoon, the sounds of the bustling city fade into a soft hum, and the warm sunlight casts long shadows across the streets. You're still walking, but now your path has shifted slightly. The thought of the mail system, the scrolls traveling across vast distances, has taken root in your mind. You begin to consider the intricacies of time and space in ancient Egypt, a civilization where the mere concept of waiting had an entirely different meaning than it does today. Think about it. In a world where communication took days, even weeks, to travel from one place to another, the idea of immediacy simply didn't exist. Messages were written with the knowledge that they wouldn't arrive for quite some time. A decree from the pharaoh might be penned today, but it might not be read until next month. The expectation was not that it would be immediate, but that it would be delivered at all, eventually. In a way, there was an acceptance of delayed gratification, a patience embedded in the very fabric of Egyptian society, and yet, even with this understanding, there was still a surprising urgency to some messages. Pharaohs, priests, and local officials often had to find ways to convey urgency, knowing full well that their letters would be read far after the moment had passed. To convey a sense of urgency, they would employ various rhetorical devices or symbols to make sure the recipient understood just how important the message was. The idea of emphasis in Egyptian communication was crucial. A letter might not arrive quickly, but when it did, it would often hit like a thunderclap. The symbols used on the outside of a scroll, or the specific language inside, would often mark the message as critical, indicating that the fate of Egypt could rest on its timely reading. This desire to convey urgency leads us to a curious aspect of the ancient Egyptian mail system, the use of symbols and pictographs. You might be familiar with the iconic hieroglyphs, those beautiful and intricate images that tell the stories of Egypt's past. But what you might not know is that these symbols weren't just decorative, they had a practical function in the mail system too. Messages that carried weight, royal decrees, legal notices, military commands, often had additional marks or symbols on the outside, signifying their importance. It wasn't just about the written word, it was about communicating beyond the word. In fact, the visual language of Egypt went beyond just writing. Think about how the art and decoration of tombs and temples spoke to the culture's deeper meanings. Now consider how that visual language permeated the communication system. A royal seal carefully stamped on a scroll wasn't just a decoration, it was a guarantee that the message was authentic and of utmost importance. The seal's design conveyed power, authority, and the divine will of the gods themselves. This unique blend of visual symbols and written language was one of the reasons Egypt's communication system was so effective in conveying status and urgency. For the person on the receiving end, it wasn't just about reading the letter, it was about understanding the gravity of it. And for those who received letters on behalf of the pharaohs, those symbols carried far more weight than just a piece of parchment. But even with these measures in place, the reality was that the Egyptian communication system still faced major delays. The amount of time it took for a scroll to move from the palace to the farthest corner of the empire was considerable. Think about how distant the regions of Nubia, Libya, or even parts of Mesopotamia were from the Nile Valley. It wasn't just a matter of transporting paper from one point to another, it was a matter of ensuring that the people living in remote locations could receive and act on the messages that were central to the pharaoh's governance. Historians still argue whether these long delays were detrimental to Egypt's effectiveness in governing such a vast empire. On one hand, some scholars believe that the lack of immediacy in communication led to slower responses to crises or worse, missed opportunities. On the other hand, Egypt's stability and centralized power could have thrived on the predictable nature of communication, with each new letter simply feeding into a system that was accustomed to the slow but steady flow of information. You might be wondering, how did this all play out when Egypt faced external threats? The time it took for military orders to reach remote forts or for soldiers to receive news of an impending invasion was one of the greatest challenges. Some of these messages could be months in transit, a fact that must have weighed heavily on military leaders as they prepared for battle. They relied not just on written communication, but also on scout networks, local messengers, and the presence of watchful eyes along Egypt's borders. The lack of speedy mail didn't stop Egypt from projecting power. It just meant they had to think of other ways to prepare and react. A fascinating detail that emerged from ancient Egyptian records is the idea of backup plans. The Egyptians didn't just rely on one courier to send a message. They often employed multiple couriers for the same message, hoping that one of them would reach their destination on time. This redundancy wasn't just a precaution, it was an essential part of the system's resilience. A message might be delayed by a storm or a broken-down boat, but the backup courier would arrive, and with him, the essential message that kept the kingdom's wheels turning. Yet for all the fascinating aspects of Egypt's communication strategies, there's something beautifully simple about it: the persistence of human effort. These messages weren't just words on paper, they were pieces of a much larger puzzle put together by individuals who were dedicated to seeing the process through. Whether they were scribes sitting at desks, couriers racing along ancient roads, or officials in far-flung provinces awaiting royal commands, each person played a part in ensuring that Egypt's great communication web remained intact. The world of ancient Egyptian communication may seem slow, even cumbersome, but it was more than effective. It was a system that worked for thousands of years, and it's a testament to how deeply organized societies can adapt to their needs, even when the challenges seem insurmountable. The sun now hangs low in the sky, and the air begins to cool slightly, a refreshing breeze ruffling the papyrus reeds lining the banks of the Nile. As the shadows grow longer and the day prepares to give way to evening, the idea of communication in ancient Egypt takes on a deeper significance. You've wandered through the complexities of how messages moved, but now it's time to step back and appreciate the bigger picture, how communication functioned not just as a tool for governance, but as a pillar of the entire society. If you pause for a moment to consider, it's remarkable how reliant the Egyptians were on this system. Every aspect of their daily life, from agriculture to religious rituals to military endeavors, depended on the timely exchange of messages. This was more than just an efficient bureaucratic system, it was the lifeblood of the entire civilization. Without it, Egypt as we know it simply wouldn't have existed. As you think about the thousands of scribes, couriers, and officials, their work takes on a new light. They were not just employees, they were builders of civilization itself. One area that really stands out in this regard is agriculture. The Egyptians, of course, were famous for their agricultural prowess. They mastered the flooding of the Nile, creating a food surplus that supported not just their population, but also the army, the priests, and the entire system of state-sponsored activities. But perhaps unexpectedly, the operation of this sophisticated agricultural system relied heavily on communication. Messages would flow from the pharaoh's officials to local farmers, telling them when to plant, when to harvest, and when to prepare for flooding. If one of these messages didn't arrive on time, entire fields could be lost to poor planning. It's fascinating to think that in such a highly organized society, every single task, from sowing seeds to building monuments, could hinge on the accuracy of communication. Yet, for all the technical detail, the role of communication wasn't solely about practicality. It also served as a means to shape the collective identity of the Egyptian people. To the common Egyptian, communication wasn't just about messages, it was about the power of the state itself, reaching out in the form of royal decrees, religious edicts, and state-sponsored projects. Those symbols, those seals, and those grand hieroglyphs weren't just official documents, they were a constant reminder of the divine connection between the pharaoh and the gods, the kings. Words weren't merely human, they were God-ordained. Each royal message carried with it not just administrative orders, but the weight of divine authority. Now imagine a poor farmer somewhere in the delta, sitting in his small home at the edge of a lush field. A messenger arrives, possibly on horseback, or maybe even by boat along the Nile. The farmer listens carefully as the messenger unfolds the scroll, reads the royal command, and delivers the message. This wasn't just a letter about planting, it was a link to the gods themselves. In that moment, the farmer's understanding of his role within the grand machine of Egypt would become clearer. The message itself would be a reminder that he was part of something far greater than his small patch of land. He was contributing to the well-being of the entire kingdom, as decreed by the divine rulers. Even so, the message could be as simple as a directive about grain quotas or an instruction to repair a local temple. Yet these simple instructions still carried enormous weight because they weren't just about food or labor, they were about maintaining the cosmic order. The Nile's floods, the sun's rise and set, the very grain that grew from the soil, everything was connected, and communication was the thread that wove all of this together. As much as we might think of ancient Egypt as being rooted in religion and mythology, their ability to convey organizational control was perhaps just as essential. Every priest, scribe and farmer was aware that their daily actions were part of a greater divine order, with communication at its core. The power of the pharaoh wasn't just symbolic, it was built on the very infrastructure of communication, which allowed him to govern a land that stretched from the bustling cities to the distant corners of the desert. In this light, the communication system was not only a practical tool for day-to-day governance, it was also a symbol of divine power. And the system was so intricately tied to Egypt's identity that it extended even to religious practices. The priests too relied on this system to spread edicts from the gods, ensuring that rituals were performed correctly and that the pharaoh's will was done. Each sacred temple, each ritual, each procession was backed by letters and decrees, written and delivered with the utmost formality. The gods themselves could hardly have had a better communication system. As you continue to walk through the streets, you can almost feel the weight of all this history. The Egyptians might have been used to this system, but for us, looking back, it's like an intricate tapestry that, despite its seemingly slow pace, held everything together. Their world was one of deliberate action, where every message was part of a grand, divinely orchestrated design. Historians still debate the extent to which Egypt's vast communication system truly influenced its long-lasting stability. Some argue that without the consistency of the royal decrees and the continual flow of messages from the pharaoh, Egypt would not have remained as powerful as it did for centuries. Others suggest that its power may have been more symbolic than real, that the pharaoh's messages were part of a carefully constructed illusion of control. Was the ancient Egyptian empire as efficiently governed as we imagine it, or did it rely heavily on maintaining appearances? Regardless of where you stand in that debate, one thing is clear. The ancient Egyptians had a system of communication that was ahead of its time. And when we think about it today, in the context of our own globalized world, their system seems not just functional, but profoundly human. A way to bridge the gap between rulers and subjects, between the human world and the divine. As the shadows lengthen and you near the banks of the Nile, the water now reflecting the rich oranges and pinks of the setting sun, you can't help but marvel at how such a seemingly simple system could have sustained an empire for thousands of years. The scrolls, the seals, the couriers, these weren't just tools of bureaucracy, they were the very essence of what made Egypt great. And in some ways they still hold secrets waiting to be uncovered. Night fully settles over Egypt now, the stars beginning to emerge in a clear sky. The only sounds are the gentle rustling of papyrus and the distant croak of frogs along the Nile's banks. It's easy to imagine how, as night fell, life in ancient Egypt slowed. But in a land where the sun was the god of life, it's no surprise that the pace of life during the day was intense. As we linger on the edges of the river, let's consider the long-distance communication aspect of this ancient civilization, a key factor in Egypt's ability to hold sway over such a vast territory for millennia. While the movement of mail within Egypt itself was a marvel, communicating with distant lands was a whole other challenge. Egypt was not isolated, even though it felt like it might have been, given the relative self-sufficiency of the Nile Valley. Ancient Egypt was surrounded by other powerful cultures, the people of Mesopotamia to the east, the Nubians to the south, and the Libyans to the west. There was trade, diplomacy, and even war, all requiring the long-distance transmission of messages. To send a letter to a neighboring kingdom like Nubia or Babylon was no simple task. Boats were the primary mode of transport along the Nile, but overland routes were also essential, and it's easy to forget just how treacherous some of these journeys must have been. Imagine being a courier tasked with delivering a letter from the pharaoh to a foreign king or queen. You would first need to travel across Egypt's land, perhaps relying on camel caravans or the occasional horse. After that, you'd cross into hostile or unknown territories, navigating deserts and mountain passes, always with the looming threat of bandits or even rival kingdoms intercepting your letter. This risk made communication between Egypt and its neighbors quite an endeavor. But when it worked, it was a testament to Egypt's diplomacy and reach. Messages could take weeks to get from one place to another, often traveling along the Nile, then transitioning to overland routes once they reached the desert or distant kingdoms. The idea of instant communication might seem laughable to us in our world of text messages and emails, but for the Egyptians, the act of sending a letter, particularly to foreign lands, was more than just a logistical challenge. It was an act of trust. A fascinating example of such long-distance communication is the famous Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondence found in the ruins of Akhenaten's city of Amarna. These letters, primarily written in Akkadian, the international diplomatic language of the time, show the intricate web of communication between Egypt and its neighboring empires. The letters reveal everything from treaties and trade agreements to personal pleas for assistance. One particularly striking letter sent from a Babylonian king requests a marriage alliance with Egypt, while another expresses concern about Egypt's military actions near Mesopotamia. These documents, meticulously inscribed on clay tablets, demonstrate the critical role communication played in maintaining peace, navigating power dynamics, and managing Egypt's far-reaching empire. What's striking about these letters is not just the content, but the sheer amount of time and effort required to transmit messages across such long distances. While Egypt's kings and queens had a solid grasp on their own empire's communication systems, foreign correspondence posed its own set of issues. Historians still argue about the exact methods used to handle these letters, whether they relied on the same couriers as those who handled internal communication, or whether they employed special diplomats. What's clear is that travel time was simply part of the process. A letter sent from Egypt to Mesopotamia could easily take months to arrive, and yet these lengthy delays didn't dampen Egypt's ability to maintain powerful diplomatic relationships. In fact, some argue that these long waiting periods might have actually enhanced Egypt's image, as the time and distance involved in the process only reinforced the mystique of Egypt as a powerful and divine civilization. Alongside these diplomatic endeavors, Egypt was also involved in trade with distant lands. As you walk along the Nile, imagine the bustling markets where precious goods from far-off lands were exchanged. There were no cell phones to confirm shipments or courier services with tracking numbers. Every transaction and trade agreement relied on carefully worded letters and seals that ensured goods like gold, silver, and exotic spices made their way through Egypt's sprawling network. The act of writing and receiving these letters wasn't just about securing trade. It was about maintaining the economy of the empire, keeping it well-fed and well-supplied with everything from building materials to luxuries from lands that only existed in myths for many of the people. But even as Egypt's message network extended to the furthest reaches of the known world, there was another side to this communication system: the communication of death. The dead, particularly the royalty and elite, also required careful attention to messages, but these were different kinds of communications. As the sun sets and the light dims across the land, think about the messages exchanged between the living and the dead. The pharaoh's message wasn't only about decrees and orders, it also needed to span time, space, and even life itself. In Egypt, the idea of posthumous communication was intimately tied to the concept of the afterlife. A royal tomb wasn't just a burial place, it was a place of messages to the gods. Hieroglyphs lined the walls, offering prayers, spells, and advice for navigating the dangers of the afterlife. These messages weren't merely for the dead, they were for the living, too. A letter to the gods was a sacred act, asking for protection and favor, ensuring that the deceased would continue to receive divine care. It was as if the ancient Egyptians believed that even in death, communication was still essential for balance and order. As you reflect on this, it becomes clear that communication in Egypt was never a simple transaction. It was wrapped up in the complex web of the cosmos, politics, and society. Messages traveled not just across the land, but through time, reaching into both the living and the spiritual worlds. Historians still ponder the deeper meaning of these communications, what messages Egypt's royal tombs were really trying to convey. Were they simply attempts to ensure the afterlife? Or were they also an attempt to maintain the power and influence of Egypt for generations to come? These messages weren't just words, they were promises, and they were powerful enough to shape the course of Egypt's history. As the Egyptian sky darkens and the constellations flicker to life, the air is still, heavy with the sense that something ancient, almost timeless, is at play. You might imagine standing by the riverbank, gazing out at the water, while your mind drifts back to the vast network of communication that once spanned across this land. It wasn't just a tool for governance, it was woven into every corner of Egyptian life, from the high palaces of the pharaohs to the humble homes along the Nile's fertile banks. And yet, despite this intricate system, one thing remains clear: the sheer dependence on human messengers who were subject to the limitations of their own strength, endurance, and, quite frankly, fate. Let's linger for a moment on the courier, the brave soul tasked with carrying the sacred scrolls and edicts, sometimes across the river, sometimes across hundreds of miles of desert, enduring the dangers of wild animals, bandits, and even the elements. It's almost hard to imagine how grueling these journeys must have been. But think about it. These couriers were the unsung heroes of Egypt's bureaucracy. They might have carried the weight of the kingdom itself on their shoulders, as each scroll they bore held not just paper or parchment, but the will of the gods, or at least the pharaoh's divine decrees. Now let's consider what this meant in a practical sense. If you were a courier, your journey would often begin at one of Egypt's major administrative centers, maybe in the bustling streets of Thebes or Memphis. You'd receive your message sealed with the royal insignia, a mark that promised the utmost importance and secrecy. As you set out, you'd likely take a boat down the Nile for as far as possible, relying on the river to carry you quickly and safely through Egypt's heartland. But then the journey would become more treacherous. Once you left the river's embrace, you'd be forced to travel over land, either on foot or by camel or donkey, navigating through harsh desert terrain where water and shelter were scarce. This section of the journey wasn't just physically draining, it was mentally exhausting too. You had to know the lay of the land, keep an eye out for potential threats, and of course, protect the precious scrolls you were carrying. Imagine the weight of that responsibility. The messenger's role wasn't just about speed, it was about survival. The ability to maintain the integrity of the message was paramount. If a courier lost a letter, or worse, If the contents of the letter were compromised, it could mean not just a personal failure, but a serious breach of trust between the pharaoh and the people he ruled. Yet despite all these obstacles, the communication system thrived. That's the real mystery. How did the Egyptians manage to keep this system running so smoothly, given the challenges couriers faced? Was it sheer determination and a deep sense of duty, or was there something more? Historians still speculate about the inner workings of the Egyptian postal service. Some argue that the couriers were carefully selected given their loyalty and endurance, while others believe that the system was so well organized that even a single courier could travel across the kingdom without much interference. Regardless, what remains clear is that the pharaoh's ability to issue decrees and laws depended heavily on these dedicated messengers. One fascinating element of the courier's journey was the physical toll it took. As they ventured across the desert, they often had to travel at night to avoid the blistering heat of the day. Imagine this: the soft hum of the night winds, the faint crunch of sand beneath your feet, and the silent stars above as you cross vast stretches of land. The night would provide some relief, but it also had its own dangers. Without proper rest, the couriers could suffer from fatigue or dehydration, threatening the success of their mission. Yet despite the harshness of the journey, many couriers continued their work with incredible resilience. Their strength wasn't just physical, it was mental too. They had to learn to trust the map of Egypt's waterways and roads, relying on the networks of local settlements and travelers to guide them. There was a great deal of interdependence built into the system, as each person along the route, whether it was a local farmer providing shelter or a fellow traveler offering directions, played a part in the successful delivery of the message. Interestingly, the role of the courier was not just about delivering royal decrees. Many couriers were also responsible for delivering more personal messages, notes between lovers, family members, or friends. These messages were often just as important to the individuals involved as the state-sanctioned documents were to the pharaoh. Imagine the joy of receiving a letter from a loved one after months of separation, knowing that someone had braved the elements and dangers just to bring you a few written words. These personal messages, though less grand in scope, were woven into the same system of communication that held the empire together. And while the job of the courier was undeniably difficult, it wasn't always a life filled with hardship. For some, it was a matter of honor to carry the royal seal, to be trusted with the kingdom's most important messages. The idea of carrying a royal decree was like holding a piece of the divine will, a direct link between the gods and the people. It's no wonder that the messenger's role carried so much weight, both literally and figuratively. Historians still debate whether the couriers were truly independent agents, or if they were part of a more formalized government-run postal service. There's evidence to suggest that the role of the courier was more professionalized than we might imagine. Some suggest that couriers were part of a wider governmental structure, trained in specific ways to deal with the stresses of the job. Others believe that the task of delivering messages was handled more informally, with each community having its own network of trusted messengers. This debate continues as scholars try to piece together the full picture of how ancient Egypt maintained such a sophisticated system. What we do know, however, is that these couriers were essential to Egypt's success. Without them, the pharaoh's voice would have been lost in the vast expanse of the kingdom. The couriers were the living links between the gods, the pharaoh, and the people. Their journeys, arduous, dangerous, and sometimes even deadly, ensured that the pharaoh's will was carried across the land, keeping Egypt united and strong. As you drift into the stillness of the night, consider the unseen hands that once held these messages across miles of desert, ensuring that Egypt remained as powerful and enduring as it did. The couriers were the silent bearers of Egypt's empire, carrying its dreams and edicts into the farthest corners of the known world. The Egyptian night has fully embraced the land now, and the air is cool as the moon rises high, casting a soft glow over the river. As you drift further into this quiet moment, you might be tempted to think of Egypt as a land bound by its own natural rhythms, its people, its gods, and its bureaucracy, all flowing along the Nile like the steady current. And indeed, while the river connected the empire, the roads beyond Egypt were just as important for those living far away from the pharaoh's reign. But there's something we haven't quite touched on yet: the system of record-keeping that tied everything together. As we've already seen, communication in ancient Egypt wasn't as instantaneous as it is today, but it was far from inefficient. In fact, the writing system itself was an art of its own, one so intricate that it still fascinates scholars today. The Egyptians had a unique method of recording history, sending messages, and even keeping track of their vast empire's daily needs. Imagine standing in front of a papyrus scroll, carefully unfolding its ancient fibers, feeling the texture of the material beneath your fingers. In many ways, this scroll holds Egypt's heartbeat, its stories, its laws, its economics, and its deep religious practices. And it all started with the act of writing, that age-old tradition that both preserved and propelled Egypt's civilization. At the heart of this communication system was the sacred art of hieroglyphs, those complex and beautifully crafted symbols. Hieroglyphs were more than just a writing system, they were a reflection of Egypt's worldview. Every symbol was a link between the living and the gods. In fact, some of these symbols were considered so sacred that only a select few could read and write them. The scribes, the keepers of Egypt's secrets, were highly trained and highly respected, almost akin to modern-day diplomats or scholars. In fact, without the scribes, Egypt's entire communication system would have collapsed under the weight of its own complexity. Historians still argue over how widespread literacy actually was in ancient Egypt. Was it confined to the elite and priesthood, or did it extend to more of the population? Some believe that the majority of Egyptians were illiterate, while others suggest that basic literacy was more common, especially among the middle class or those involved in trade. Regardless, it's clear that the act of writing wasn't just a technical skill, it was an essential part of Egyptian life and spirituality. Imagine yourself as a scribe for a moment. You're sitting in a quiet courtyard with a reed pen in hand, your fingers stained with ink, preparing to record a royal decree. Your task is simple in theory, but complex in execution. You must record the exact words of the pharaoh, ensuring that nothing is lost in translation. The slightest error could be seen as a betrayal, a failure to uphold the divine will. So you write carefully. Each stroke of the pen, each symbol placed in its proper order, is an act of divine service. In ancient Egypt, the scribe was seen as an intermediary between the gods and the people. What was written wasn't just a message, it was an echo of the divine itself, a link that connected the earthly to the celestial. It's not hard to imagine why the scribes were so highly valued. Their role in maintaining the bureaucratic system that governed everything from tax collection to military conscription was critical. In a way, the scribes embodied the heart of Egypt's organization, ensuring that everything from monumental temple construction to daily bread distribution was meticulously recorded. Without them, the entire system would have collapsed. Historians still debate the role of the scribes in Egyptian society. Some argue that they were more than just record keepers. They were intellectual elites, the thinking class who helped shape Egypt's culture, laws, and even religious practices. The debate continues as scholars dive deeper into the lives of these early bureaucrats, wondering just how much influence they really had on Egypt's decisions. While the pharaoh was at the top of the political ladder, the scribes were undoubtedly the backbone of Egypt's communication infrastructure. But while the scribes kept order through their inscriptions, the written word was also a tool of propaganda. Egypt's rulers were keen to project their divine right to rule, and what better way to do that than by carving their accomplishments into stone? In temples, tombs, and pyramids, you can still find the words of kings and queens inscribed in hieroglyphs, telling their stories to the world. These inscriptions weren't just about documenting history, they were about shaping it. They were a testament to the eternal nature of the pharaoh's reign, and they had to be perfect in every way. This need for perfection didn't just apply to the writing, it applied to the whole process of documenting Egypt's grandeur. Each letter, each carving, each scroll was meant to immortalize the pharaoh and his empire for eternity. And of course, these inscriptions and scrolls didn't just serve the living, they also carried messages for the dead. The Book of the Dead, for example, was an ancient Egyptian funerary text that guided the deceased through the afterlife, ensuring safe passage to the field of reeds. As much as communication was about governing the living, it was equally about honoring the dead. The pharaoh's decree might dictate taxes, but it also might dictate rituals for the deceased, ensuring that they were properly remembered and cared for in the afterlife. It's fascinating, isn't it? The way in which Egypt's entire communication system spanned time and space, bridging the living and the dead, the mundane and the divine. In every scroll, in every carving, in every word, there was a sense of continuity, a sense of purpose that reached beyond the temporal world. The pharaoh's word was law, but it was also sacred, a law that applied not just in this life, but in the next. Historians still argue about how religion and bureaucracy intertwined in Egypt's communication systems. Was the pharaoh's role primarily political, or was it spiritual? Were his decrees divine or simply pragmatic? While some scholars assert that Egypt's rulers were seen as living gods, others believe that their role was more earthly, focused on maintaining order and prosperity in the kingdom. Either way, Egypt's communication system was a testament to the power of the written word and the cultural importance of preserving the will of the pharaoh, not just for his reign, but for eternity. As the night continues to stretch its long fingers over the land, the air cools even more, and the silent sweep of the river carries us deeper into the mystery of Egyptian communication. The intricate system of scribes and couriers, with their carefully crafted scrolls, is part of a larger puzzle that connects the ancient Egyptian world, and that puzzle is more than just about transporting messages. It's about how Egypt, as an empire, maintained its extraordinary unity and cohesion over such a vast expanse. At its core, this was not just a matter of keeping track of people or resources. It was about maintaining a shared identity, a cultural and political continuity that transcended borders. Now take a moment and imagine yourself in one of Egypt's administrative centers, perhaps in the bustling streets of Memphis or near the grand palaces of Thebes. You could be standing in a courtyard filled with the sound of chattering people and the faint clinking of metal as a messenger arrives from a far-off province. His feet are caked in dust, his clothes travel-worn, but he bears a vital message, and as he hands it over to a scribe, he is greeted with the gravity of the moment. The content of his letter might have been carefully written on a piece of papyrus, but the act of receiving it, of handling it, felt almost like touching a piece of the divine world itself. It wasn't just a message, it was a link to the very heart of Egypt, to the pharaoh's will, and to the pulse of a civilization that spanned millennia. In the same way that we use digital communication today to stay connected across great distances, the ancient Egyptians relied on their own method of keeping the empire united. But the scale was so different, so vast, that one can only begin to imagine what it must have been like to carry the weight of imperial communication. Whether it was the pharaoh's latest decree or a message from a priesthood seeking guidance. In the moment, it might have seemed ordinary, but in hindsight, these messages were the threads that tied the very fabric of Egyptian society together. Let's step back for a moment to look at the practical mechanics of this system. Egypt's communication network wasn't just about messages being written, it was also about how physical spaces were organized to facilitate this transmission of information. Major cities and towns weren't just homes, they were nodes in a vast network. You can almost picture a map of Egypt, dotted with temples, administrative buildings, and town squares that served as places of exchange, where news and decrees were passed from one hand to another. Think about it. If you lived in a remote village, there was a clear process for how information trickled down to you, how you would be notified about the pharaoh's latest orders or any changes to the law. This intricate web wasn't just geographical, it was also deeply social. The people involved in passing information had roles that extended beyond mere logistics. There was a hierarchical system in place. High-ranking officials were the ones who typically handled the more important, sensitive messages, while lower-ranking individuals dealt with less urgent matters. So, in a sense, the information didn't just flow, it was filtered, ensuring that it reached the right people at the right time. This made the Egyptian communication system not only efficient, but also incredibly secure. The pharaoh could trust that his messages were in safe hands, making sure that the kingdom's unity wasn't just preserved by the written word, but by the people who transmitted it. But beyond the administrative purpose of the communication system, there was also something deeply spiritual about it. Egypt's messaging system was not just for practicalities, it was also an essential part of the cosmic order. The concept of Ma'at, or cosmic balance, was central to Egyptian thought. Everything from the movement of the stars to the rise and fall of the Nile was seen as part of this divine harmony, and the pharaoh, as the divine ruler, was the protector of that balance. His decrees weren't just law, they were part of maintaining the very fabric of the universe. When a message was delivered, it wasn't just a law being passed down, it was a sacred order being upheld, preserving the cosmic order that allowed Egypt to thrive. Historians still argue about the role of religion in Egypt's administrative system. Was it a means for controlling the people? Or was it a genuinely spiritual system that sought to preserve the divine balance of the universe? Some argue that the pharaoh's role was more political, that he was merely a symbol of power, and that religion served as a way to maintain control over the populace. Others believe that the Egyptian system was deeply rooted in spirituality, where communication was a divine tool to maintain harmony between the gods and humankind. In either case, the role of communication was vital. Messages, after all, were not just words, they were vehicles of power, connectors of gods and people, and crucial elements of cosmic law. In the same way that the Nile flows to nourish the land, the written message flowed to nourish the social and spiritual structure of Egypt. And it wasn't just about the pharaoh's word, it was about the god's voice being channeled through human messengers. The royal decrees, the temple inscriptions, and the official scrolls all carried the divine will, and so the messenger's role was seen as a sacred duty. As the moon rises higher, reflecting on the river's surface, think about the incredible mystique of it all, the simplicity of a written message, the complexity of its delivery, and the sacredness that infused every part of the process. Egypt was a civilization that lived in constant communication, not just with each other, but with the gods themselves. Historians still debate the importance of oral communication in ancient Egypt, wondering if the written word was as central to the Egyptian experience as we believe. Was there a more oral tradition that existed alongside the written system? While we have evidence of great scribes, we also know that many messages were probably spoken, especially in public spaces like marketplaces, temples, and the royal court. What we do know is that Egypt's system of communication was vast, far-reaching, and deeply intertwined with both its social structure and its spiritual beliefs. In the end, Egypt's success as a kingdom, as a civilization, was grounded in its ability to stay connected, not just through physical messages, but through a shared sense of purpose, a belief that the will of the gods and the laws of the pharaoh were woven into the very fabric of life itself. As you drift further into the stillness of the night, you can almost hear the faint rustling of the papyrus scrolls, the whisper of the messengers, and the quiet hum of a system that, despite its complexity, kept the empire together for thousands of years. The cool night air is now tinged with the promise of dawn. The Nile still glimmers quietly, its waters flowing as steadily as Egypt's centuries-old systems of communication. It's fascinating to think about how these methods of connecting people were more than just functional. They were woven into the very essence of Egyptian life. The scribes, the messengers, the royal decrees, these were fundamental to the way Egypt structured its empire, maintained its vast territories, and connected its people from the bustling cities along the Nile to the farthest reaches of the desert. But communication in ancient Egypt wasn't just about the bureaus and the messengers. In a world without radios, telegraphs, or modern forms of technology, Egypt's rulers were incredibly creative in their approach to sending messages across great distances. Stone inscriptions were perhaps the most famous and enduring form of communication in Egypt, standing the test of time with their grandiose carvings that decorated temples and tombs. These inscriptions weren't just historical accounts, they were propaganda, designed to project the majesty of the pharaoh's reign. Imagine for a moment that you've just traveled across Egypt's vast desert, a journey that likely took weeks, if not months. Your destination, a temple or monument dedicated to the pharaoh, a place where visitors from all over would marvel at the scenes etched into stone. These weren't merely decorative, they were declarations meant to proclaim the divinity of the pharaoh and showcase his great achievements. The imagery of the pharaoh's victory in battle, his divine parentage, or his connection to the gods, was carved into the stone with incredible precision, a visual message for anyone who laid eyes on it. These monuments were designed not just for the present moment, but for eternity, a reminder of the pharaoh's reign for generations to come. But the scale of these stone inscriptions wasn't just about propaganda, it was also about record-keeping. Every major event in Egypt's history, from military conquests to religious ceremonies, was meticulously carved into stone, ensuring that the details of Egypt's greatness were preserved for the future. These monuments acted as a written record that, like the papyrus scrolls, told the story of Egypt's glory. Even after thousands of years, we still stand before them, gazing at the elaborate carvings, trying to understand the messages they contain. In fact, historians still argue about the nature of these monuments. Were they primarily political tools, or did they serve a deeper religious purpose? Were the pharaohs truly divine beings, or were they simply powerful rulers whose authority was bolstered by religious symbolism? The answer, of course, may lie somewhere in between. Egypt's rulers were both political and spiritual leaders, and their monuments and inscriptions reflected this dual role. Some scholars argue that these monuments were part of a broader effort to solidify the pharaoh's authority, while others suggest that they were integral to the religious fabric of the nation. In either case, these monumental messages were designed to immortalize the pharaoh's legacy, and in doing so, they helped maintain a sense of continuity within Egypt's complex administrative system. As we leave the stone monuments behind, let's turn our attention to the realms of communication that were more personal, those that were far more likely to touch the lives of everyday Egyptians. Sure, most of Egypt's communication infrastructure catered to the needs of the elite, the pharaoh and the temples, but what about the common folk? How did messages travel among the people? Here we see another example of Egyptian ingenuity. Despite the grandeur of the pharaoh's royal edicts and monumental inscriptions, Egypt's communication system was also incredibly localized. Smaller towns, villages, and even neighborhoods had their own ways of staying connected. One important form of communication was the messenger system, which, as we've seen, relied on a network of couriers traveling on foot or by donkey. These messengers didn't just carry royal decrees, they also conveyed more personal messages. Think for a moment about the role of letters in ancient Egypt. Much like today, letters could convey a wide variety of messages, from business deals and political announcements to personal notes between friends or family members. We often think of ancient Egypt as a place of monumental stone carvings and grand decrees, but it was also a society of personal communication, where letters were used to stay connected across the vast distances of the empire. And while these letters might not have carried the same grandeur as the royal inscriptions, they were still vitally important in shaping the relationships and the day-to-day lives of Egyptians. Historians still debate how widely accessible writing was to the average Egyptian. Were letters something that only the elite could afford to send? Or was writing and communication part of a larger cultural norm where even ordinary Egyptians were able to participate in this system? Some scholars argue that literacy in ancient Egypt was restricted mainly to the elite class, priests, scribes, and government officials, while others suggest that writing may have been more widespread among the middle class, especially in trade and commerce. But what we do know is that in this world of stone monuments and royal decrees, there was also a thriving culture of personal communication. In a land of kings and gods, ordinary people still found ways to connect, to send their messages across the miles. And whether these messages were grand and formal, or small and intimate, they were all part of the great tapestry of communication that kept Egypt's mighty civilization humming along. You can almost hear the rustle of papyrus as these letters are carefully unrolled, the faint scent of ink and parchment hanging in the air as the ink is carefully applied to the surface, capturing the words that would bridge distances, bring distant loved ones together, or even share news of a harvest or a death. Messages, whether from the divine pharaoh or from a common worker in a far-off village, became threads in the same woven fabric that made up Egypt's great society. Historians still argue whether the personal letters in ancient Egypt were seen as just as important as the grand royal decrees. Were they a reflection of Egypt's more personal connections, or were they simply tools to further the state's goals? In the end, what's clear is that the messages of the people, whether carved in stone or written on papyrus, were vital to maintaining Egypt's unity and identity. The night deepens, the stars hanging low above the Nile, as we continue to unravel the tangled threads of Egypt's communication system. The sky, as timeless as the land beneath, reminds us of the immense span of time over which Egypt's methods of transmission persisted. These systems weren't just about the here and now, they were part of a lasting legacy, a part of the foundation upon which Egypt's dynastic continuity rested. As we drift deeper into the history of Egypt's communication practices, we begin to see just how these systems influenced not just the flow of information, but also the concepts of power and identity within this ancient civilization. At the heart of all these messages, whether they came from the pharaoh or a lowly villager, was the need to preserve order. The state relied on communication not only to maintain control over the vast empire, but also to maintain the very identity of Egypt itself. This was no mere kingdom, it was an empire bound together by a complex web of social, political, and religious forces, and the smooth functioning of this empire depended on the uninterrupted flow of information. Whether it was about a tax decree, a military campaign, or a ritual procession, The ability to transmit such messages quickly, securely, and consistently was paramount. It's almost like imagining a giant network of minds, each person, from the humble farmer to the highest-ranking priest, carrying and receiving pieces of the grand puzzle of Egypt's world. With each passing year, these pieces became more complex, more intricate, but they never lost their connection to the heart of the empire, the pharaoh, the ruler god, at the top of it all. The message, no matter how small or grand, was always part of the whole, and each message reinforced the unity of Egypt's incredible political and spiritual infrastructure. But what about the technology behind this communication? How did ancient Egyptians manage to send messages across such vast distances with limited tools? After all, they didn't have the luxury of modern transportation. There were no airplanes, no trains, no trucks to carry their decrees and orders. Instead, the ancient Egyptians relied on a surprisingly efficient method involving messengers who walked, rode donkeys, or even traveled by boat. It might seem rudimentary to us, but for its time, this method was highly effective. This system of couriers was largely based on established routes, and these routes were often maintained by temples or government offices that ensured messages could flow without interruption. The couriers, many of whom were highly trained for the task, were adept at traveling long distances, often carrying several messages at once. They knew exactly when and where to stop, when to speed up, and how to navigate through difficult terrain. It was a system that relied not just on the physical speed of the messengers, but also on the network of knowledge they carried with them. One of the quirkiest things about Egypt's messenger system was that it was, in many ways, quite similar to the famous Pony Express system used in the United States in the 19th century. The basic concept was the same. Messages needed to be delivered quickly, and messengers had to be capable of covering vast distances with speed. However, unlike the Pony Express, which used horses in a relay system, the Egyptians didn't rely on horses. Instead, they made use of donkeys and boats, which were more suited to their environment. Donkeys, though not as fast as horses, were invaluable for their stamina and ability to navigate the deserts and the Nile Delta. On the water, Egypt's extensive network of river transport was used to move messages quickly and efficiently, allowing couriers to travel along the Nile, one of the world's oldest highways, and reduce the time it took to deliver important information. Historians still debate just how much these couriers relied on rivers to carry messages, or whether desert routes were just as commonly used. Some suggest that river transport was far superior for long-distance communication, while others argue that desert routes, cutting through the sand with their isolation and challenge, provided a more secure and direct route for important messages. Either way, Egypt's geographic advantages, rivers, deserts, and well-maintained trade routes played a huge part in making their communication system possible. Beyond the mechanics of communication, there was another layer to the system: ciphers and codes. Like any empire, Egypt had to ensure that sensitive information, especially relating to military matters or royal secrets, was kept safe. While we don't have many surviving examples of encrypted messages, historians speculate that the Egyptians, much like other ancient civilizations, likely used codes to protect their communications. These could have involved simple techniques like substitution ciphers, or even more complex systems for disguising messages. Given Egypt's emphasis on secrecy, particularly around the pharaoh's decisions, it's reasonable to think that such practices were in place. In some ways, Egypt's secrecy about its military activities and royal decisions can be seen in the very structure of its communication network. Only a select group of officials, scribes, couriers, priests, and high-ranking military officers were trusted with the most critical messages. This meant that a network of confidential couriers existed, those who carried military orders, instructions for tax collection, or the pharaoh's personal will. And only a handful of people ever knew the true content of these messages. This kind of secrecy ensured that Egypt's central authority remained unchallenged, and that sensitive information never reached the wrong hands. Historians still argue whether this secrecy was a sign of a paranoid state, or if it was simply part of the natural functioning of an empire that had to safeguard its unity at all costs. Some suggest that Egypt's focus on security was a reaction to external threats, like the incursions from neighboring lands, or perhaps a response to the ever-present risk of internal rebellion. Others believe it was part of a broader strategy to maintain the aura of divine rule, ensuring that only those in positions of power could ever truly understand the full picture. As we drift through this long night, the quiet hum of the river feels like the sound of Egypt itself, constant, unwavering, and deeply intertwined with the messages that flowed through it. The stones, the papyrus, the messengers themselves, all of these were part of a larger, complex system that kept Egypt's mighty empire alive for over 3,000 years. And though we may never fully understand all the intricacies of Egypt's communication networks, one thing is clear. Without them, Egypt could not have thrived as it did, nor would its incredible achievements have been preserved for us to marvel at today. The river begins to slow beneath the soft shimmer of the stars, its waters whispering secrets from a time long past. It's here, in the stillness of the night, that we come to the final chapters of Egypt's intricate world of communication. Having already seen how the pharaoh's decrees traveled across vast deserts and fertile lands, we now turn our attention to the more subtle forms of messaging, those small, personal interactions that connected people at the most intimate level. These forms of communication, unlike the royal edicts or monumental inscriptions, were often less grand but no less essential in shaping Egypt's society. Despite the grandeur of Egypt's monumental stone inscriptions and royal decrees, a far more pervasive form of communication existed among the general population. Imagine, if you will, the bustling marketplaces along the Nile, where merchants shouted their wares, farmers discussed the day's harvest, and ordinary citizens shared news of births, weddings, and even the death of a loved one. These personal exchanges weren't immortalized on stone tablets or papyrus scrolls, but they were nonetheless central to Egypt's social fabric. Egyptian society, after all, was a place where communication wasn't just about grand gestures or royal declarations. It was about sharing stories, building relationships, and making sense of the world around them. Whether it was gossip exchanged over a shared meal, a request for help, or the offering of advice, these personal messages often carried more weight than anything written on the walls of temples. Historians still debate the significance of these informal exchanges. Were they simply the backdrop of Egyptian life, or did they play a more central role in how Egypt maintained its societal cohesion? Some argue that the heart of Egypt's society lay in the informal networks of communication between its citizens. In a society so steeped in rituals and religion, these everyday exchanges were vital in keeping the social order intact. Others suggest that these informal messages were secondary, insignificant when compared to the grand structures of communication controlled by the state and the temples. But one thing we can all agree on is that, in the grand scheme of things, the ability to connect with one another was an integral part of what made Egyptian society function. Without these personal networks, Egypt's grand communication infrastructure would have been meaningless, an empty system of messages with no one to hear them. Perhaps the most touching part of this personal communication was the role of letters. Those simple, intimate messages exchanged between friends, family members, and loved ones. Imagine receiving a letter, carefully rolled and sealed with wax, from a relative who had traveled far from home. Or perhaps you're the one writing the letter, the ink flowing across the papyrus as you describe a joyous occasion or seek advice about a difficult matter. In the ancient world, where long-distance travel was often treacherous and time-consuming, these letters carried not just information, but a piece of home, a connection to the lives of those far away. The act of writing itself was both a personal and sacred task. When an Egyptian wrote a letter, it wasn't just about putting pen to papyrus. It was about communicating a part of oneself, whether that was sharing good news or seeking comfort in times of distress. And just like today, the act of reading a letter from a loved one brought a moment of connection, a link across time and space. There was a shared human experience in these exchanges, a recognition of the deep need to be heard, to be understood, to reach out across the miles. As much as Egypt's communication network was rooted in its grand political system, it was also grounded in these human moments of connection. Despite the vastness of Egypt's empire, it was built on the simple idea that humans need to communicate with one another, to share their joys and their sorrows, to exchange wisdom and advice. These personal messages served as the foundation of Egypt's identity, just as much as the royal decrees that traveled the highways of the empire. And then there was the question of language, the way the Egyptians spoke to each other through both their spoken words and their written messages. The Egyptians, like most ancient societies, didn't have a uniform language across all regions. Instead, they had multiple dialects, each suited to the diverse regions and peoples that made up Egypt. But the written script, the hieroglyphic system, was the unifying force that helped to bridge these divides. While the spoken word might have varied from one town to the next, the written language of hieroglyphs, and later the simplified hieratic script, acted as the common thread that tied Egypt's far-reaching society together. Historians still argue whether the diversity of language in Egypt ever caused significant misunderstandings or communication breakdowns. Some suggest that regional dialects created a sense of division in society, while others believed that the writing system was so effective that it overcame any such challenges. Regardless, the fact that Egypt's written communication could transcend these differences is a testament to the strength of its system. Despite all this, there is still an element of mystery surrounding Egypt's communication practices. We have countless records, yet we can only guess at the subtleties of the messages that were exchanged. Some letters, for instance, have survived, but they are often fragments, pieces of a much larger puzzle. Some historians have even speculated that Egypt's ruling class may have gone to great lengths to limit access to certain kinds of knowledge, keeping information within the circles of the elite. If this is true, then perhaps the full story of Egypt's communication remains hidden, locked away in the remnants of those personal exchanges we can only dream about. And as the cool air continues to sweep across the landscape, there's something quietly reassuring about knowing that despite all the grandeur of Egypt's monumental achievements, the essence of this civilization, its communication, was rooted in the same simple human need that we experience today. The desire to connect, to share and to be heard. The night deepens further, and we find ourselves approaching the final chapter of this journey through ancient Egypt's vast communication network. It is in this quiet, reflective space that we begin to feel the weight of all that has been shared, awaiting with a civilization whose long-lasting power and cultural influence were, in many ways, built on the strength of its ability to connect, preserve knowledge, and share its world. Egypt's communication systems were not simply about sending messages. They were about creating and maintaining a worldview, a grand narrative that stretched over millennia. And in this final moment, we'll step back and appreciate how the ancient Egyptians managed to weave all these threads together. The Egyptian writing system, with its iconic hieroglyphs, was not merely a method of communication, but also a way of encoding the very essence of Egyptian life, its myths, gods, and legends. The written word was used to express the divine order of the universe, the Mayat, which was the balance of all things in the cosmos. To write was to assert control over the chaos of the world, to create meaning from the floods and deserts, from the life and death that defined existence. Every royal decree, every letter, every inscription was not just about transmitting information, it was about reinforcing the divine order of Egypt, its imperial power, and its place in the world. But communication in ancient Egypt wasn't limited to the written word alone. Think of the massive stone monuments scattered across Egypt, each one a testament not just to royal or divine power, but to the very idea of preserving time itself. These monuments, like the pyramids, the temples, and the obelisks, were not just physical structures. They were also messages etched in stone, lasting symbols of Egypt's eternal nature. They carried information across time, sending a message to both the present and the distant future. We are here. We will last forever, they seemed to say. In a way, Egypt's monuments were its most enduring form of communication, carrying its identity into the future with a confidence that few other civilizations could match. These massive stones, towering into the sky, served as both cultural markers and beacons, guiding travelers, traders, citizens alike. In that sense, the pyramids weren't just tombs, they were part of a communication strategy designed to proclaim Egypt's place in the world for generations to come. Historians still argue whether the monuments' true purpose was more about power and control, or whether they were truly about preserving a message for posterity. Some believe the enormous scale of Egypt's monumental architecture was less about showing off and more about crafting a permanent legacy. Others argue that the grandiosity of these structures was simply a reflection of Egypt's absolute belief in its eternal rule. But whatever the true purpose of these monuments, there is no denying their impact on Egypt's communication network. In fact, these structures were the physical embodiment of everything the ancient Egyptians communicated through their written texts, oral stories, and rituals. And when you stand before one of Egypt's towering temples, pyramids, or obelisks, you can feel the same power, both the message and the messenger. They weren't just building for themselves, they were communicating with future generations, hoping that their stories would be heard long after their time on Earth had passed. In contrast, we are left with a final paradox: the very communication. Systems that kept Egypt strong, that preserved its culture, and helped it prosper for millennia, eventually gave way to change. The arrival of new empires, Greek, Roman, and later Islamic, meant that Egypt's once untouchable systems of communication had to adapt, and some were lost forever. The rise and fall of civilizations, the shifting sands of history, meant that the messages Egypt had worked so hard to preserve were slowly lost to the winds of time. Yet, even as these changes swept over Egypt, its cultural and intellectual legacy, encapsulated in its communication methods, would inspire generations to come. The fact that we can still read Egyptian texts today, the pyramids, the temples, the mummies, and the letters that have survived the ages, speaks volumes about the resilience of these communication systems. The ancient Egyptians were masters of preserving and transmitting their knowledge, their culture, and their identity across the centuries. In a way, they achieved what they set out to do. They conquered time itself, ensuring that their messages would echo throughout history, even as their civilization crumbled. As we approach the end of our journey, the Nile's waters have slowed, and the stars now reflect in the quiet surface. In this deep silence, there is a certain peace, the kind that comes from knowing that we've not just learned about a civilization, but that we've connected with its core. We've seen the power of communication, its ability to transcend time and space, to connect people and ideas, to preserve both identity and knowledge. And perhaps, in a strange way, the ancient Egyptians still speak to us today, not just through their monumental architecture or their mummified remains, but through their messages which have traveled through the ages and reached our ears across centuries, across millennia. As we settle into the night, think of this journey as one final message, a connection passed through time from those who came before to those who remain. Perhaps that is the greatest communication of all, the knowledge that we are all part of a larger story, a timeless thread that links us to the past, present, and future.